US President Donald Trump is expected to arrive at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing with President Xi Jinping in the next few minutes. It's Trump's first presidential visit to China since he was there in 2017 during his first term. Trump says trade is the main focus of his trip. He's accompanied by several influential business leaders, including Elon Musk and CEOs from Apple, Nvidia and Boeing. Before departing, Trump said he would ask President Xi to open up China to increase the presence of US companies doing business there. On Iran, Trump said he didn't need China's help on the conflict, but confirmed that the issue will be discussed. Trump also said he plans to raise the topic of US arms sales to Taiwan, a move strongly opposed by Beijing. Well, our correspondents are in the Chinese capital. We'll speak to our chief US correspondent, Alan Fisher, in just a minute. But first, let's go to Katrina Yu. Katrina, so how important then is Trump's visit to the Chinese? Because Beijing, of course, has some big issues to address, like Taiwan, tariffs, and trade stability for Chinese companies.
I think it's difficult to overstate just how important this visit is. President Xi Jinping, he hosts state leaders all the time, but none quite as powerful and quite as unpredictable as Donald Trump. And Beijing has said time and time again, there is no relationship diplomatically that is as important as the relationship between Beijing and Washington. Now, the issue is that last time Donald Trump was here in 2017, China greeted him with much fanfare. It was a very lavish visit. But when Trump went home, almost straight away, he launched that first trade war against China, and China was really caught off guard by this. So China learned its lesson, and now it has a very tricky balance to play. It has to flatter Donald Trump, show him respect, work closely with him, get what they want out of him as well, their own deliverables, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily trust Donald Trump. Now, when it comes to those deliverables, what are China's priorities? You alluded to them, Darren. Trade stability, better tariff terms, preferably, and I think really the real priority for China is to inject momentum in what has been a stubbornly slowing economy. It wants to do deals with China, yes, to reassure Chinese investors, but to ensure investors all around the world and raise some confidence and boost activity, economic activity.
Yeah, Katrina, one second. Just as we're speaking to you, President Trump has arrived at the Great Hall of the People. He's been met at the steps there by President Xi Jinping. So the live pictures that we're seeing on our screen is now of the two leaders. President Xi was coming down the steps a few minutes earlier. President Trump arrived in his motorcade. They're now walking together at the bottom of the steps of the Great Hall of the People. President Xi is walking with President Trump and introducing him to various dignitaries from the Chinese delegation. So that's the live picture we're seeing now on our screens. You were talking to us now about what's likely to come out of this meeting.
Really interesting. These two men have just met. They're walking up the stairs. These two leaders couldn't be more different. Obviously, Trump very brash, very direct, and Xi Jinping a completely different style of leader. He's very distant, very aloof. He speaks in poetry and metaphors. So anything could happen in this trip, and this is why the whole world is literally watching. Now, I was mentioning the technology is going to be on the agenda. We know that Nvidia, the chip maker's boss, Jensen Huang, was a last-minute addition on Air Force One. He is here. They have custom-made a chip, the semiconductor H200, for the Chinese market. Donald Trump has actually approved for that chip to be sold in China, but the stalling here is coming from China. Xi Jinping has told his companies not to buy it because he wants to support the local homegrown semiconductor industry. So that's going to be talked about, no doubt. And lastly, of course, for Xi Jinping, there is no issue more important than Taiwan. He sees Taiwan as a rogue Chinese territory that will one day be reunified back with Beijing, under Beijing's control, using force if necessary. And now we know that Trump has held up a record arms package, arms sales worth $14 billion to Taiwan. He has said that he is open to discussing this with President Xi, alarming some of US allies in the Asian region. So for Xi Jinping, Taiwan will be front and center. And if he can manage to get that arms sale package reduced, that will definitely be seen as a win for China.
All right, Katrina, stay with us. We're going to cross now to Alan Fisher, our chief US correspondent. Alan, as we're coming to you, we're watching these live pictures of President Xi meeting members of the American delegation with President Trump behind him there. Alan, so Trump clearly sees this visit as hugely important for the US economy. What will he be looking for in terms of tariffs, investment and benefits for American companies, Alan?
Let me just point out one thing, Darren, before we go into that, and that is Marco Rubio is on this delegation. He's there in the Great Hall, and he has been sanctioned by the Chinese twice, and they have used a sleight of hand almost to allow him to come into the country. They've changed the way they spell his name, which is different from the exclusion order, so the sanction order, so that allows the Secretary of State to be there in the Great Hall. Yes, Donald Trump is looking for some sort of economic benefit from this trip. He's looking to sell more agricultural produce to the United States, to China, like beef and soybeans. He wants to make sure that there's more inward investment by the Chinese as well. All of these are really important for Donald Trump, but one of the key things he wants is to open up the Chinese market, 1.4 billion people, to American companies. He thinks that the Chinese have been very protectionist. He sees one way of forcing them to do this through a board of trade. Both countries will sit on that and they will discuss problems with commerce between the two countries. But it's clear that Donald Trump definitely wants to get some sort of economic win that he can take back to the United States for this, because there are tensions. These summits don't tend to often produce great results simply because both sides are deeply suspicious of one another. And of course, as Katrina was saying, the tariffs question, what the Chinese are looking for there is some stability. Remember, at one point, Donald Trump imposed sanctions, tariffs of 145% on Chinese goods. What China wants is a regime that kind of lasts for a year and doesn't just move on the whim of Donald Trump and whether or not he's upset by something he might have seen on social media.
Yeah, Alan, stay with us, won't you? But before we go back to Katrina, let's just look at some of these live pictures coming now from the Great Hall of the People in the Chinese capital, Beijing, where both leaders are taking the salute from a military band. Let's just listen in to what's happening. All right, so live pictures there coming from the footsteps of the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, where US President Donald Trump is meeting the Chinese president. The first visit by a US president in close to 10 years to China. So President Trump and President Xi Jinping taking the salutes there from the military band, standing on the dais there as an officer walks up to the two leaders to take the salute. Let's just go back to Katrina Yu. Katrina, just briefly, before we move on the issue of some of things like Iran and so on, just talk us through the significance of this meeting at the Great Hall of the People.
Well, the Great Hall of People really is the equivalent of the seat of power for China. It's the equivalent, I guess, of the White House and all other important centers of power. This is where it all comes to. Xi Jinping conducts all of his most important official business in the Great Hall of the People. All other state leaders enter here. They're all given a sort of salute. And really, China is really heavy into its symbolism. It's heavy into the visual optics, and it uses these little subtleties to really convey the importance of the visitor, the importance of the guest that Xi Jinping is greeting or hosting. Interestingly, when Donald Trump first arrived in 2017, he was the first leader to arrive in China to be given a state visit plus status. So I think that shows how important he is. One thing to note, though, is that when Donald Trump was actually greeted by China's officials when he arrived on the tarmac in Beijing yesterday, he was greeted by Han Zheng, who is the vice president of China. But interestingly, he has more of a ceremonial role. For example, he's the one who attended the coronation of King Charles, not member of the highest level of the Politburo. So I don't know if there's anything to read into there, but certainly China is aware that it wants to give Donald Trump a big show. It wants him to feel flattered. It wants him to feel very respected by China, and they do indeed respect him. And so I think we're going to see an equivalent spectacle, and we are seeing an equivalent spectacle as China literally does roll out the red carpet for this leader.
Yeah, Katrina, and how do ordinary people in China look at this visit by President Trump?
I think ordinary people are very fascinated. This is what everyone is talking about. It's on the front pages of every newspaper here. State media is talking about this. I think people are aware of how monumental this meeting is and how impactful it could be going forward. However, many people are also very wary of Donald Trump. They don't trust him simply because of how they feel he's attacked China, how they feel he's attacked China unfairly, not only from the first trade war and this trade war, but also during COVID and all of the other things that have happened over recent years. One thing that's really interesting is that Trump has a few nicknames here in China, and one of the most popular is Chuan Jianguo, which literally means nation builder. And they're not talking about Trump building up the nation of the US, they're talking about Trump building up the nation of China. And this is because they've said that many of the things that Trump has done, that first trade war, a lot of these trade restrictions, trying to really contain China, has had the opposite effect of boosting many of China's homegrown industries, and that indirect effect of actually making China steadier, more stable, and more powerful than it was before all of those things were imposed by Trump and his administration.
Yeah, Katrina, as we're talking to you, we're seeing pictures of both Trump and Xi walking on the red carpet past hundreds of school children, I guess, waving pom-poms and dancing and waving in the air. So I think the formalities are due to close, and then they'll move up the steps again back into the Great Hall. One of the other big issues, Katrina, the Iran war, of course. China has always been reluctant to get involved in foreign conflicts. Is Beijing likely to give Trump any help with getting a deal with Iran?
I think this is one of the biggest questions that we're asking about this visit. On the surface, on the global stage, China has again and again repeated that it is happy to do whatever it can to contribute to ending this conflict. China's been quite critical of the US and Israel starting this war. It's been very critical of the US blockade of Iranian ports. China wants to see the Strait of Hormuz reopened. Not only because 30 to 40% of its own energy flows come through that vital choke point, it also buys Iranian oil itself. So it wants to continue buying this. The issue is, though, that China has interestingly been distancing itself from Iran at the same time. It's been saying it's not a party to this war, that it just wants a ceasefire to continue, to talks to continue, but it has been kind of downplaying its ability to exert influence over Tehran. And the reason being is because some countries, including the US, have been accusing China of supporting Iran, of directly or indirectly helping the Iranian war effort. And we've actually had from the US recently sanctions on a number of Chinese companies, at least 5 so-called teapot oil refineries, as well as Chinese technology companies, for their role, they allege, in supporting Iran. Now, China has been very upset about this. It's actually told its companies to ignore those US sanctions, to keep continuing business as usual. So I have no doubt that Iran will come up in this visit. It will be talked about. It won't necessarily be a very comfortable conversation. And I think ideally Beijing would have liked Iran to be resolved by now. I think it sees it as an unhelpful distraction to what it sees as its more important goals in meeting with Donald Trump.
All right, before we go back to our chief US correspondent, Alan Fisher, let's just look in and tune into some of the sights and sounds coming from the military ceremonial parade taking place as President Trump meets President Xi in Beijing. Right, so you're watching this grand spectacle, Beijing rolling out the red carpet for Donald Trump's visit to Beijing and his meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. You had marching bands there, you had children waving pom-poms and flags. A big spectacle for Donald Trump as he arrives at the Great Hall of the People in the Chinese capital, Beijing. So you're watching both leaders there. They've moved off the saluting dais after that marching band went by. They took the salutes, they played the national anthems, and now they're just waiting with the delegations at the footsteps of the Great Hall of the People to go up into the hall just